even if they start to having international effects sometimes. It's hard to limit the what happens on the internet into a particular jurisdiction. So what we're really saying is that, yeah, we agree. On the proposal itself, it's always good to talk about proposals from a multi-stakeholder model, but we need to enhance this discussion a lot. And I also agree with you on the fact that probably right now, first time after the decision, the ICANN model, the multi-stakeholder model, is challenged more than ever. And some to the extent is that the countries and governments maybe forgot and taken things for granted. It just works. Without thinking about some of the legislations they might come up with will have a severe effect on people's ability to connect to the internet. And I think we have a place there, and I think the community has a place there. We just need to continue to work better together. We have to take that challenge on. So thank you very much, Yrjö. And I wouldn't mind if you said it in Finnish, by the way.
I could say the Swedish.
Good. Thank you, Göran. Anyone else who wants to comment on this topic, either from the board or the ALAC? No? Good. So, oh yeah, I see Matthew's hand is up. Matthew?
Thanks, Leon. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate the words from Yrjö on this, because one thing's for certain is that, and as Göran has said, we do need to work together. The environment is changing rapidly. Some of the things that we may have depended upon, and Yrjö and I go back some ways in the WSIS process and everything else, that the dynamics and the situations are very different now. So I think the more that we can share intelligence and information about what's happening at the local level, the better place we are to promote the multi-stakeholder model and what ICANN stands for, and its value it brings to this ecosystem. So thank you for the suggestion, and very much appreciated.
Thank you, Matthew. I see both Sebastian and Maureen's hand up. I believe that Sebastian was first, so I will go to Sebastian, and afterwards to Maureen, and then Ellen.
En français. Bonjour. Merci d'avoir cette conversation et ces outils d'interprétation.
Yeah. This conversation and those interpretation tools, Sebastian speaking, I totally agree with what Yrjö said, and I would like to add one point. Nonetheless, at EURELO, we are trying to have several actors in the European Union. I know several people working very hard with their governments in Europe. It's true in France. It's true in the UK and in other countries. And the support of ICANN for multi-stakeholder activities is very important. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Sebastián. Efectivamente, hagamos uso de los servicios.
Thank you very much, Sebastián. Let's just use our interpretation services. There's two more hands. There's Maureen and Alan, but I think she prefers Alan to go first. So, Alan, you will now have the floor, and then Maureen will go afterwards. Alan, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Just a very brief comment. Yrjö made reference to a joint GAC-ALAC request going back, I believe, about 6 years on the need for documents and briefings from ICANN in words that don't use any buzzwords for the people who are unfamiliar with what we're talking about. And that includes new GAC members, new at-large participants, and we're still not seeing a lot of that. So I guess I'm just restating the request from, I think Yrjö said ICANN 60. It sounds about right. And it's something we still need on a regular basis, and we're just not seeing it enough. So thank you.
Maureen, sorry, I was on mute.
Thank you. I just wanted to, just to confirm, what my team has actually sort of like said today. But if I could just indulge the board for 1 minute, I would really like to take this opportunity to thank Julio Lanzipuro for the brilliant work that he's done as our GAC liaison over these many past years. And this is his final meeting as the GAC liaison. He will be passing the baton over to Joanna Coletta in future meetings. But I just wanted to make mention that I really appreciated the work that that Julio has done, and just wanted to make that a public announcement today. Thank you.
Here, on behalf of the board.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Julio. Good. So maybe we can move to the next topic. Could we have the question in the screen, please? Good. So our next topic is on the expected advice, and recently, or to be sent to the board. What would you like to explain or comment on? Are there any improvements to the current process the board uses to address advice that you would like to suggest? So with this, I would like to, of course, open the floor for our ALAC colleagues to give us their insights. So if we can now switch back to the mosaic mode, that would be perfect. Thanks. So who would be speaking on this first, Maureen? I think it's Olivier. Good, Olivier. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Leon, and I hope you can hear me. My name is Olivier Crépin-Leblanc, and I will actually flip the question around, because we started with the question saying, what advice do you think we should look at the moment? And then how is the board to treat the advice? And I was going to just give you a quick intro of how the Consolidated Policy Working Group works in at-large. That was created a while ago to treat every single piece of policy that at-large has to deal with. As you know, at-large has to comment, or can comment, on pretty much everything and anything that happens in ICANN, not just GNSO matters, but pretty much everything else. So we had two groups created, one to deal with process, that was the operational and financial budget committee group, and on the other side, the policy working group, which Jonathan Zook and I co-chair. And it does require a couple of chairs due to the amount of work, as you can understand, that takes place in there. We have weekly calls, and we not only produce the advice for the policy advice commenting that is a pipeline that you constantly have, but also we are the group that supports the people that are now in the expedited and the non-expedited policy development processes that you are seeing in the generic name supporting organization, since the system has changed from an individual model to a representative model. So we have representatives there, and of course they need all the support from our group to be able to navigate and to get the room in which they can discuss the issues that are taking place on the PDP. It used to be a time when the ALAC used to write the advice. So here now we have, of course, the Consolidated Policy Working Group writes the advice. So we've got a larger set of people writing it. And then the ALAC finally stamps it, if you want, ratifies it, because every advice that comes out of the ALAC needs to be ratified by the 15-member at-large advisory committee. But that being said, a few years ago, and I'm speaking quite a few years ago, that piece of advice or text used to be lobbed over a wall and caught somehow by the board. And there were times when we never heard about it. I think that this is something of the past, and it's changed, and the processes have improved greatly, not only because the board has now produced some documents which are publicly available so that we can see how the pipeline workload is going on the board, so we know when our advice is being addressed or looked at by board members. But additionally, because in recent times we've had increased interaction and two-way discussion, and I think that's a really great thing. And today, for example, is one of these days when we will have that interaction with Alan Greenberg, who's going to focus a little more on the expedited PDP, on the GTLD registration data, that good old friend that we've had for quite some time, and focusing specifically on the SSAD. And without further ado, I'll let Alan take it over. And I think that he has a presentation, so the presentation has to come up on that. Alan Greenberg.
Thank you very much, Olivier. Yes, there is a presentation. We saw a discussion last week, I guess, with the board on the sub-pro advice we gave, and the board came back to us with a whole slew of questions, which are quite interesting, and we will be responding to them. This presentation pushes that concept to a different level and suggests that maybe sometimes discussion is necessary before the board has done its initial deliberations on it and come up with questions. In the case of the ALAC EPDP Phase 2 advice, this advice is unusual in a number of different ways, and we believe that a discussion, and not only a presentation, but a discussion of it, is warranted before the board takes action, before the board comes back and asks us detailed questions. And this is a very brief attempt to do that right now in this session. Next slide. If you look at the advice, we start off by summarizing what we believe the needs were in an SSAD and commenting on to what extent we believe they were addressed. The first major issue is the SSAD was supposed to provide consistent, predictable responses to legitimate RDDS access requests and do it in a timely manner. When you look at what came out of the PDP, we have service level agreements, which timely is not quite the word for it, where it could take up to 2 weeks on the average, but not even a maximum, to answer regular requests. It assigned priorities which were not deemed to be acceptable by many of the people around the table who will be submitting requests. There was virtually no automation. Every individual registrar would be answering the request according to their own policies and practices. In terms of cost effectiveness, since this was expected to be paid for by the users, and probably we estimate something in the order of $10 to $20 million to implement over several years. We just don't believe that what comes out of this system is going to be anywhere near justifying the cost and effort that was gone into it. And lastly, any system has to work in a changing environment. It has to be agile, and the processes that the PDP recommended for modification and evolution of the SSAD just don't come anywhere near meeting that target. Next slide, please. In terms of the process that was followed, we have severe concerns that for the first time ever, the GNSO is passing on to the board for consensus policy recommendations that did not have strong support from the community, from the PDP working group. There were a number of recommendations that were defined in the report as strong support, but strong support is by definition most of the groups supporting the recommendation, and in some cases we had well over a third of them that don't support. So most is a questionable word. Moreover, the GNSO forwarded to the board recommendations for implementation as consensus policies where there was no consensus. And that just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Lastly, we hoped at the time that the report was issued, the legal natural issue would be certainly discussed and resolved to a better extent than it was then. We've now finished the EPDP Phase 2A, and it's quite clear that there's been virtually no change whatsoever. Next slide. The net result is the SSAD is a very expensive, complex ticketing system, potentially long and costly implementation, and it's not clear that it will even be used because the PDP requires that operation be self-funded, and it's not clear that whatever the costs come out of it are going to be ones that are reasonably going to be borne by the potential users. And you know, the ALAC has not a large part in this, but the same statements have been made by the potential users. Security, the intellectual property communities have all expressed severe doubt that the cost process, that the financial aspects of it are going to be acceptable. Next slide. So we have a real problem. The ALAC still believes that the system for standardized access for non-public registration data, that's the term that ICANN and the GNSO used going into this process, is still needed. But we don't believe the SSAD, the previous slide, please. Yeah, we don't believe the SSAD is such a system. So, you know, we believe we need a system like this, but the only system that's been presented to the board is one that we do not believe will come anywhere near meeting the targets. Next slide. So we need a system. Ensuring that such a system is used by the contracted parties is a GNSO responsibility. I mean, the board is fully able to mandate that ICANN org build a system that does everything we want, but you can't mandate that it be used. And that's a real problem. And only the GNSO or negotiations can do that. And we don't believe the system delivered by the GNSO is fit for that purpose. Next slide. So how do you resolve the stalemate? And you know, that's a problem which is sitting on the board's desk right now. And what we did in our advice is an attempt to start chipping away at the problems that we're faced with. And there's no attempt at all to believe that we have the complete answer. And that's part of the reason we're having this session, because we think that discussions are going to be necessary, not just something coming out of the board as a magic silver bullet answer. Next slide. Okay, next slide, please. So our advice consisted of 3 parts. 1, we don't believe the SSAD should be approved because it will involve huge expense, time, and we don't believe what's coming out of it is going to be satisfactory. We believe that the ticketing system aspect of the SSAD is exceedingly important. We want to be able to track what's going on. But that doesn't need to be a system anywhere near as complex. For instance, it doesn't need accreditation. It doesn't need response times. It doesn't need all the difficult parts of the SSAD. And we believe that's something that can be done either largely from components ICANN already has, or can be obtained on the open market or cobbled together. So we think that's a relatively quick and simple thing to do that would benefit the community. Lastly, we believe NIS2 will likely have significant impact because NIS2, at least in the versions we've seen so far, is going to mandate things that many of us were hoping would come out of the EPDP, but didn't. So presuming NIS2 does get adopted, and we can't predict that, but we believe it is currently being discussed by the Parliament, and we believe what will come out will be a significant change. But at that point, we're in an other interesting problem. The European registrars and those subject to European law will have to adapt to this, but we'll now have registrars in other parts of the world who can still bypass it all. That's going to lead to a very uneven playing field, And we believe a PDP should be initiated to make sure that all contracted parties are following comparable rules. Next slide. And that's where we are. So at this point, if board members have any questions about the statements we made or the advice, we'll try to address them. And I'd like to open this up to an interesting discussion of other ways that we can go forward. As I said, the ALAC doesn't pretend we have all the answers, and there are some complex problems. And if anyone else would like to raise things, not as board solutions, but as simply ideas that may need to be talked about, developed, and enhanced, I'd be delighted if we heard some of that. And I'll turn it back to Leon.
Thank you very much, Alan. So I think Becky would like to address this in the first place. So Becky, if you would like to take the floor.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Alan. That was really excellent presentation recapping the advice, which I reread this morning, and it was very useful. Let me start out by saying that I think everyone on the board had hoped when we adopted the temp spec and went into this process that we would end up with a reliable and consistent and predictable solution for delivering WHOIS data, registrant data, to those with legitimate needs to access the data. That was all of our goal going in. I think, unfortunately, the reality of not being able to get very clear advice from the data protection authorities and the place where phase 1 ended up in, which was that that it was likely in the end, with respect to disclosure, always going to come down to a question of a contracted party, usually a registrar, making a determination, applying the European, the GDPR balancing test, and making a decision about what way to move forward. And once you're in that situation, what you can have is an efficient intake system, but you cannot guarantee the outcome because it depends on applications of interpretations of the law. So at some level, I think we all share the disappointment that we were not able to end up in a place where we could say that we knew when information, circumstances under which registrant data would be disclosed and when it wouldn't. And you, because you sat through all of those calls with me, you know that, all of the advice that on legal and natural and on all of those other things that we pushed very, very hard on, including in particular, what I thought was going to give us some helpful information to the implications from NIS2, what we were seeing with URID and .eu and all those. We pushed really hard to say, does that give us a precedent for understanding a better way to make determinations about that? And the legal advice was equivocal at best. So I think I don't want to diminish anything other than to say, I think that we understand the disappointment and wish we were in a different place with respect to this. We do really appreciate the advice that we got. We are working through it, and I think we have sent some clarifying questions. I understand the value of the conversation first, but it is important for us to understand those responses and questions. And then finally, I think we have embarked on the ODP process. The ODP process, one of the issues is going to have to deal with, can we build it? How much is it going to cost? Will it come in at a point where people will be able to pay for it? And and I think we're all agreed that probably the most expensive part of the system is going to be the accreditation system. So I can't tell you where we're going to come out other than to say, we feel your pain in terms of we wish that we were in a position to deliver more certainty. We will certainly consider the advice very carefully. We really appreciate the input and look forward to this conversation. And we're having the ODP precisely to answer some of the questions that you've pointed to and raised.
Thank you, Becky. I see two hands up, one from Hattie and the other one from Alan. But I would also like to take us back to the original question that we posed to the ALAC, which is the expected advice sent recently to be sent to the board. What would you like to explain or comment on? Are there any improvements to the current process the board uses to address advice that you would like to suggest? So I would rather have this discussion with the ALAC in regard to a more to a wider view of how we handle advice rather than just centering in the ESAD advice that was sent to the board, and that we have begun addressing it with this pilot in the fashion that we work with the GAC as well. So I will go to Hadia and then to Alan. Hadia?
Thank you, Leon, and thank you, Becky, for this explanation. And so I raised my hand to comment on what Becky was saying, but I would also address what you were saying, Leon. So I think the question, Becky, is why would we build such a system, right? And not necessarily how much it would cost, and but why do we want the ESAD? And before answering this, I would just like to reiterate that the ALAC and at large, we were always looking for a standardized system for access for access or disclosure, and we are still looking for a standardized system for access / disclosure. But the current system automates the recipient authentication and transmission of ESAD requests, but all disclosure decisions, apart from limited use cases, are handled in a manner just the same as it is handled right now. So the question becomes, what is the purpose of building this system? And then Leon, going to your question, and then maybe I would also answer with another question. Like, if you receive advice, is the board agile enough in order to, could it like based on an advice like suggest modifications or alternatives to a proposed policy? Or does it have to go back to the GNSO and then it goes through the whole process all again, right? Like, if you do want to respond to a certain advice, but that advice would necessarily need some change in the policy developed. How does this happen? Thank you.
Thanks, Hadia. So I guess Joran would like to comment on some of the points that you've commented to. Yeah.
It is true that the ESAD doesn't change who makes the decision. And that is unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you see it, not depending on anything that ICANN does. That is the law. The law is very specific when it comes to the role of what we call the controller. And we talked about this before, and there is several determinations that the controller needs to do to be able to share that data with anyone else. What is so famously called balancing test is one of them, where you balance the right of the registrant in this case and the need of the information from the requester. But there are also other decisions that has to be made. There are other international laws relating to this, like international data transfer. Is it possible? You can only transfer when it comes to European citizens, there are specific specifications about that. The NIS2 as itself, and I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to say that I understand correctly how NIS2 will be written up or done, because it's not done yet, might simplify for the contracted parties the variables they have to take into account when they do those assumptions, including the balancing test. That doesn't change that it's still, according to GDPR, the responsibility of the contracted party. And this is worth repeating, and I think it's good to remind ourselves that that's why I whatever comes out of the community is always the best for me. But I think that's one of the challenges in this view of looking at it. The SAD model could never take away the responsibility for the contracted party, and we did actually try. If you remember the strawberry model, we went to the European Commission, we went to the data protection authorities and said, hey, we would like to have ICANN org legally responsible for this balancing test. And we wrote a whole paper about it. We did a lot of work together with many interested community members. And unfortunately, it stopped. And I might sound a little bit critical, but the Belgian Data Protection Authority turned to the European Commission and said, we can't take this to the Data Protection Board. It has to be done by the European Commission. And unfortunately, they never did that. But we have tried different angles to change that. And I'm very old, I'm not very agile. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Göran. Now to the second point that Harry was raising, I believe Martin would like to comment.
Yeah, no, very quickly, but basically the point that you made is, would the board be agile enough? In our thinking, maybe, but we are also bound by the bylaws that have been agreed by the community. And in that way, we're trying to find our best way forward, which means we need to follow the process that we all agree to. What we try to do here, and this was the intent of the question, is really to get the best out of the advice and the interaction. So in that way, to see how that could work best. So referring to some of the content information Göran rightly gave about the asset, let's not forget it's also how the law has been built up, how difficult it makes to make something that is actually fulfilling that obligation in a good way. Also on the other side, let's find a way where we can get the best out of the advice process within the bylaws. Otherwise, you have to change the bylaws. Alan, with all respect for everything you bring, but if you want to talk before we ask the questions, how we prepare for meetings is by thinking, so what do we want to know? So there's the questions. So we're trying to engage in the best way possible in that way as well. So let's not see it as a one-time off thing. But as we've developed with GAC over time, a predictable process where it's clear where we're going to come in, how we make sure that we get it right and take that into account while doing our job as mandated by the bylaws. I hope that helps. That is a limitation to the agility of how we can act as well.
Thank you, Martin. And thank you, Alan and Jonathan, for waiting patiently. I will now go to Alan and then Jonathan. Alan?
Thank you very much. A couple of quick points, and I won't be very long. A lot of what Becky went into, and to some extent Göran, is expressing the, I guess angst is the best word, of our level of dissatisfaction with how the PDP turned out and how it was run. And it ranges from phase one discussions where we never discussed the balancing test with regard to what should be redacted or not. And that is something that that GDPR allowed and requires. But we can't change the history right now. We are where we are, and we have to deal with it and make something come out of it as best we can. With regard to the process, and back to Leon's question and Martin's comment of you can't discuss it until you've considered it. Let me bring another tone into this. When we write this kind of document, we have choices to make. You know, do we do a 3-page document as we did in this case, or do we do a 50-page document going into excruciating detail of exactly what our thinking is behind the conclusions we've come to, and perhaps more detail of possible outcomes? And to be honest, we have a lot of concern with doing the latter. Number one, it's a exceedingly time-consuming process for people who are doing this on a volunteer basis. And just editing a 40-page document just takes an almost infinite amount of time. Moreover, there's always the chance that not everyone's going to read it in excruciating detail if you put a long document in. So this time, in any case, we chose to do a very terse, short document. But by definition, it's not going to be complete. And that's why, you know, certainly in my opinion, it's worthwhile having a discussion early in the process, just to make sure that we're getting our message across. And to be honest, a public meeting like this is probably not the best forum for that. But I do believe that early discussion is something that, especially in a complex area like this, can probably yield better results than just documents back and forth, even if it's, and thank you, at least it's not one final document at the very end. Now we're doing things on an interim basis and trying to refine our positions. But I think the earlier we can have discussions of complex issues, the best we are. Now, that probably wouldn't apply to the sub-pro one, which is has so many facets and so many aspects. But for something like this, I think it has merit to consider going forward. And you know, that's really one of the things we're bringing into this discussion. That discussion earlier and oftener is probably likely to lead better results. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Jonathan.
Thanks, Leon. Jonathan Zook here for the board. I can throw my camera on briefly to be more personable. Thanks again for meeting with us. We always value these meetings with the board. I wanted to go back to Leon's question about the advice process generally, and ask a question. I hope in a neutral way with respect to ALAC advice and its juxtaposition to the participation of at-large volunteers in policy development processes. Because we, Olivier and I in the CPWG have worked to try and organize that committee to be a place not just for the generation of advice, but also for the development of positions and the support of volunteers that then are assigned to participate in PDPs, whether it's a representational model or not. That's kind of how we've organized it, and to provide this kind of virtuous feedback loop if the new issues arise or compromises are suggested, et cetera. And that sort of has become the role of the CPWG, is to develop positions, iterate through with the volunteers and their participation in the work groups. And then the and then the public comment process comes out after that. And then the advice process has evolved into almost a kind of an appeal process, or a tactic of last resort or something, if it makes sense. In other words, if we find that our arguments are found persuasive in a work group, we don't find the need to put advice on that, right? And there are going to be instances in which we, for one reason or another, don't get our way in a work group process, or as a result of the public comments that we posted. And so there will be instances in which our advice are reflective of things that we've said before, but still consider it important to have this mechanism of giving advice to the board, despite having voiced these issues as part of a work group process, despite them not winning the day in the GNSO public policy development process. But I guess I wanted to make sure that that's not something. I want to make sure that we're not creating a situation where we're undermining the impact of our advice through our participation in these work groups. We've heard from time to time from a couple of board members and from some other workgroup participants that somehow there's something somehow disingenuous about participating in the policy development process and then providing advice anyway that's counter to that consensus. And I think that's a perfectly healthy way for the ALAC to operate. But I guess I would love your feedback on whether you view that to be the case. I think it is the way we should operate, because the better that the earlier we're involved, it is better. And we, when we weren't doing that as much, then we got a lot of criticism that we would wait for the end of a 5-year policy development process and then put advice in, right? And so I just want to make sure that there's nothing we're doing to bias the advice process through the early participation in the policy development process. Just a topic for conversation.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So I see Becky's hand is up, so I will go to Becky, and then I would like to make a couple of comments myself. Becky?
So, Jonathan, you raised a very interesting point, and I'm probably speaking for myself, but I suspect my view is shared by most of the board, that you are not compromising or undermining your position as an advisory committee or your ability to provide advice by participating. We, very much appreciate the fact that we have is where both ALAC and GAC are deeply involved early on in the process, and we think that's healthier and produces a better result. The question is exactly what you put it, like, okay, now the policy development process has run through. There was, it worked the way it is supposed to work. I mean, unfortunately, it didn't produce a huge degree of consensus, but it followed the steps it was supposed to take. And now we have a policy recommendation. I guess we don't actually have it quite yet. Since the GNSO's Council is doing phase 2A, I guess, this week. But and then the question is, so can you come in and and what's the value of your advice now? Is it just another bite at the apple? I think that the advice that you provided was not just another bite at the apple. I think that it was quite I think that it was quite useful and constructive. It sort of placed a lot of issues on the table. So I don't think that you should feel like you're somehow handicapped in terms of commenting. I do wish that we could find ways to reach sort of closure on things a little bit earlier. And this is just an interesting question. I mean, at the point where the EPDP moved from the uniform access model to the SSAD, it seems to me it should have been clear at that point that what was going to be delivered was a centralized intake system that did not guarantee outcomes. And so my question is, was that unclear? Is there something we should have done to make sure everybody was on the same page in a better way? So now I'm going back into the process of the EPDP. But my only question is, with the advice coming afterwards, was, should we think about whether there were steps in that process as it was going along where there was a disconnect, and what came out on the end was a surprise to what we thought when that transition was made from UAM to SSAD. And I mean, that's the same, but yeah.
Thank you, Becky. So if I may now make a couple of comments, and I will switch to Spanish. Bien, gracias, Jonathan, por regresarnos al...
Thank you, Jonathan, for bringing us back to the main issue in our discussion. I think we are experiencing an evolution. We're witnessing an evolution in the way in which policies are made within ICANN. For a long time, those of us who were in the advisory committees, we were asking for a voice and for more early engagement in policy development processes. And so finally, this happened. Now, policy development, from my point of view, is being more plural, more inclusive of other parties that make up ICANN. And it is true, probably within the process, we are not really successful in showing some of our points. However, I didn't really see this as a way to reduce or diminish the importance of the advice provided by advisory committees such as ALAC or GAC. I do believe it is an opportunity to have an impact on policy and a second opportunity to show these issues to the board that we believe are important. In this case, there's the impact in internet end users. And I think the advice offered by the ALAC to the board is even more relevant because it's not only a committee that provides better knowledge and better precision and accuracy in policy development, but it is also the product of a long discussion within the ALAC and within the at-large community, and I believe this increases the value. Now, if we add the exercise we have been engaged in with the advice recently provided by ALAC to the board, what we see is that the board and the org want to elevate the discussion and to place the advice we receive from the advisory committees in a much better place. I think we need to encourage dialogue. We need to encourage the possibility of having this interaction in the discussion. And in this discussion, you provide us with your advice. We can ask some clarifying questions, and then finally, we can have a better way to consider this advice and add it to the board sessions. Thank you, Jonathan, for bringing us back to the discussion. And obviously, if somebody else would like to take the floor, maybe Martin, if you'd like to say something about this, you can have the floor, and I will be very thankful for this.
Thank you. No, just a good discussion, but it's about making things work. I have nothing to add to what previous speakers said. So thank you. It's really about getting things done together, also respect the bylaws, and yeah, in no means that if you feel you're not heard, you can express that. But this is part of the system, right? This is also why the board, every time we get a PDP, the first thing we do is go to public consultation. It's it's built in the process. Avery knows much more about that than I do.
Avery.
Yeah, I certainly did not raise my hand because I think I know more about it than you do. I did want to add a comment on the whole, is it second bites of apple? I don't think it is. I think it is very, and I think others have pretty much said this, but I want to add one piece. And oh, did I say this is Avery speaking? I want to add one piece that it is important that you participated. It is important that you repeated the things that you had said before and you don't think were taken properly into account. And I think that that is a critical thing. And you may have other advice too, which you hadn't spoken of. And I think what that places on us is sort of the duty to make sure that the things that you spoke of in the PDP have indeed been discussed and dealt with. Then there becomes a question, did they deal with them properly? And that becomes a separate question. But there really is an absolute requirement of the GNSO Council and of the PDP to have addressed it, even if they addressed it incorrectly. So there's really two different issues going on here. Was your advice taken seriously, considered, understood, and you know, dealt with in one way or another? And then is there an issue in your advice that even though it was dealt with, it still represents a problem that hasn't been dealt with? And I just wanted, so I really wanted to say that I don't see it as a second bite of the apple. I see it more as, see, we took a bite of the apple and it still hasn't been taken care of and such. So I hope that helps and doesn't confuse things more, but I really see that as what is incumbent on us as a board. When we have the PDP, we have the recommendations that were, you know, especially those that were supermajority recommendations. And then we have, but we discussed this and you didn't take care of it advice. So I think that that's very, I also think it's great, now just reiterate, that you send a short one and we do the iterations that Leon spoke of. And we go through and make sure we get to the point where we understand each other, as opposed to you spending forever writing 50 pages, where we would have even more pages of clarification, I would assume. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Avery. We have exhausted the allocated time for the meeting, so I would like just to give the chance to Jonathan if he wants to close the discussion on this topic very quickly, Jonathan, and then would go back to Martin to adjourn. So, Jonathan?
Thanks, Leon. I didn't mean to try to get the last word, but it is an interesting question for us in the CBWG and then in turn the ALAC. How we differentiate between our activities of direct participation, public comment, and then advice. And I think we do endeavor to make those things narrower and narrower as we go, so that by the time something is in fact advice to the board, it's as refined and as specific as possible, and confined to those things that we consider to be of relatively higher stakes than perhaps many of the things we might have commented on within the work group or within the public comments. And so we certainly endeavor to do that. I'm not saying we're successful all the time, but that's our attempt. But it's not always clear, you know, what we should put where. And I just wanted to clarify with the board, and I got that clarification, so thank you, that treating it as a kind of escalation path that says, okay, we have brought this up, but we still think it didn't get suitably resolved in the policy development process, and so we bring it to your attention directly. That's something that the board finds. Then that's that's in line with our thinking. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, thank you everyone for attending the meeting. I would like to turn back to Martin so that we can adjourn. Martin?
Maureen, any last words from you first? You're muted.
Thank you, Martin. I just wanted to say thank you so much for allowing us to attend today and be involved in such a productive discussion. And we really appreciate that we've been given an opportunity to share what are our interests and concerns, and we're certainly looking forward to our next future meetings. Thank you.
Yes. From our side, also high appreciation of the way you fly. And basically, you want to add something. How can you add it best? And that is what we all are striving for. In fact, the board itself is seeking for that as well. One of the proof of that is that we published our liaisons document, in which we describe how we think we can engage best, while we'll still have to keep the right to, in the end, take the decision, because that's so I think there's always opportunities for improving, and we're very happy to seek the best possible ways forward with you, and really appreciate the continued constructive attitude and discussion we had tonight. So with that, 7 minutes over time.
Thank you.
But there were
so
7
much.
good minutes. So this meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.